Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I was on call the night the water changed. My name is Alex Carter, Senior Operator at the Riverview Municipal Water Treatment Plant, a low cinder block maze on the edge of town between the river and the freight spur. We serve 21,000 people across 3 pressure zones, from the river flats to the ridge where the high school sits. Our plant's rated for 12 mgd, million gallons a day, but we usually run 5 to 6, more in summer when sprinklers hiss across lawns. Our process is textbook. River intake with travelling screens, alum for coagulation, flocculation in paddle basins, sedimentation, dual media gravity filters, a UV rack we got a grant for, and a chlorine residual we maintain at 0.8 to 1.2 mgl free at the clear well. From there, 2 high service pumps push to an elevated 1.5 million gallon steel tank above town, and a pair of ground tanks that stabilise pressure overnight. That's the dry version of what I do. The human version is that a handful of people keep a town breathing without ever being seen. We take calls at 2 in the morning for taste and odour. We run jar tests at dawn to keep turbidity below 0.1 NTU through the filters. We argue with budget committees about a filter underdrain that's 30 years old. We write SCADA alarms so the operators after us won't miss a drop in the chlorine feed. We calibrate online analyzers, and then we stand back and hope the river stays where it belongs. On the first night of the outbreak, the river smelled like rain, even though the forecast was clear. We'd had a grass fire upstream a week earlier. Ash on the banks comes back to haunt you when the water rises. I logged it and bumped the pre-chlorine dose a hair to knock down the earthy taste that always brings phone calls. My partner, Dana, was halfway through a backwash on filter 3. Its head loss had crept high and she hated surprises. The UV rack hummed like always. SCADA showed the elevated tank at 72%. The night dispatcher had called to say a couple of residents near Maple and 5th were complaining of chemical taste. That happens when someone leaves a lawn service tap open and back siphons a little fertilizer into the curb line, or when we chase a leak and the system burps air. I put on a jacket and drove out to pull a sample, just in case. Riverview at 2 AM is a map of sodium vapor streetlights and one very bored convenience store clerk. I bled a hydrant on Maple in a clean sample bottle, flushed till the water ran cold, checked free chlorine with a DPD kit on the tailgate under my flashlight. 0.92 mgl. That's in spec. pH was steady. I tasted it. Tin cup. A habit I picked up from an old operator who swore you can sense problems before the meters do. It tasted like tap water. Back at the plant, Dana rolled her eyes when I told her what I'd done. "You'll live," she said, and went back to wrestling the filter to waste valve that always sticks. At 4:17 AM, the ER called the police desk, which called the plant, which is how I learned that a volunteer from Saturday's 10K hydration station on Oak Street had been admitted with a high fever, vomiting, confusion, and then agitation severe enough they had to restrain her. She'd drunk from a cooler filled by a hose at the firehouse. They asked if anything was wrong with the water. I pulled our last week of bacteriological results. Weekly total coliform sampling by state rule. All negative. I told the nurse what I can tell anyone. Our disinfection is in range, our turbidity is good. We had no main breaks that could have caused intrusion. She said 2 more people from the 10K were on their way in. By 6, the clinic was full. By 7, parents were calling the school to say their kids wouldn't be in because of that bug. By 8, the superintendent told us he'd shut off the fountains and asked if the bottle coolers were safe. I wanted to say yes, because bottle coolers make people feel safe, but I didn't say anything I couldn't prove. We flushed hydrants near the schools and pulled more samples. Everything in our numbers looked like a normal day in a plant that needed a new chlorine injector but still held together. At 9:30, The numbers stopped mattering because the people did. You'd think the first sign would be sirens or smoke. It was a sound I'll never forget, a run of shouts in the distance layered over the kind of quiet you only get at mid-morning on a school day. Then a horn, leaning on itself somewhere uptown, long and flat. I stepped out onto the plant's gravel apron and felt the river air, cool and clean. Dana joined me. We both heard it, the horn stuttering, the shouts, something that didn't carry like a crowd, but like dozen voices out of sync. The first radio call came from Engine 2. Dispatch, we have multiple calls of persons acting violently at the Fresh Mart on Spruce. We are responding. Please advise PD. The grocery store. I'd known the store manager, Omar, since before they remodeled the freezer aisles. He stocked the fluoride rinse we buy in jugs. I grabbed the plant's handheld and put it on the fire channel. Operators are the only civilian city workers who monitor everything when it goes bad. Another call. A driver had gotten out at a red light, dazed, then lunged at someone. Then the school resource officer called for backup at the elementary drop-off because a parent was in the lane trying to climb into other cars. The police channel went chaos first. Officers shouting cross streets. One transmission full of wind and then silence. You learn to hear the gap after Unit 21, confirm location, and know that nobody can. We locked the plant. It's a habit drilled into you. If the system goes off the rails, you don't let the room with the SCADA screens and the racks of sodium hypochlorite become a place someone can wander into. Dana took the back gate keys. I raised the chlorine dose slightly and opened the contact time calculation we keep taped to the wall by the Clearwell panel. CT tables. You track disinfectant concentration times time against water temperature to verify virus inactivation. It was a reflex more than a plan. Something was wrong, and more chlorine is the thing you do when something is wrong and water is your world. At 10:11 a.m., the county sent a code red alert. Shelter in place. Avoid contact with individuals exhibiting aggressive behavior. Do not congregate. The message didn't mention water. My phone lit with texts from a dozen friends asking if the water was safe, and my heart sank because the truth is, we didn't know. We only knew our numbers, and the numbers are not the world. At 10:27 a.m., the first of them reached the fence. I call them the infected because that's what makes sense to say. Zombies feels like TV and costumes, and what I saw was people who had been our neighbors an hour before, moving with a stiffness that looked like they were walking through knee-deep water. Their eyes weren't dead. They were focused and empty at the same time, which sounds like a contradiction until you see it. They didn't react to our shouts. They didn't stop when the alarm horn went off. They drifted along the plant's chain link toward the intake road, the way deer will follow a fence line, looking for a gap, bumping and clawing and pushing without language. When one of them found the gate, they pushed harder. It bent. Dana and I had radios, flashlights, a couple of wrenches, and a 2x4 we kept near the chlorine room door to prop it open when the latch sticks. We had a fire extinguisher. We didn't have a plan for people coming over the fence. The first help we got was from firefighter Sergio Torres, whom I'd seen 100 times at hydrant tests, and 3 others in turnout coats. They rolled up in the brush truck, that's the small wildland unit with a skid pump and a bumper bar, and took one look at the fence and put the truck's bumper into the gate, pushing it back to straight, while Dana spun the padlock through. Then they parked the truck across the intake road, hit the siren in a quick burst, and stepped out with gloved hands and calm voices. "Back inside," Sergio said. "Lock doors. We're staging here for now." He had a radio and a face like someone memorizing a map he'd never seen. 2 officers stepped out of a cruiser. Maya Lee and Tom Alvarez, partners you see at the Peanut Festival and at worst days. Tom had a patrol rifle threaded with a sling. Maya had a bullhorn. They tried talking to the people at the fence, the way you talk to someone in shock after a crash. The people didn't answer. When they pressed forward, Maya sprayed a line of OC spray and it didn't do much. Tom racked the rifle when one of the people threw themselves at the chain link so hard the metal lifted from the posts. I wish I could say we solved anything that day. We didn't. We survived the first wave because people used habits they already had. The fire crew backed the brush truck to block the entrance, kept the siren for short bursts that herded the infected away from the fence edge, and used the truck's PA to send them down the roadway like moving cattle. The cops set a quick perimeter that collapsed the minute a group of 12 or 15 infected came around the back side, where the fence meets the riverbank. The infected weren't fast, but they didn't tire, and each impact on the fence delivered the same force as the one before. The chain link began to bow. Sergio asked me if there was a way to isolate the plant from the town. "Valves," I said. "We can shut the high service pumps and close the main to the elevated tank. That cuts pressure to the whole grid." He nodded like he was adding it to a list. The call that changed our day came at noon from Captain Janet Park at Station 1. "All units be advised. School district has opened the high school as a shelter. Report there if you can safely disengage." It wasn't the county's plan. The county plan said the civic center would be the shelter of record. But the civic center was on the flats, and the high school sat high with a gym you could barricade. It had a diesel generator for emergency lighting and kitchen service windows you could hand through. The high school also had a metal shop, and as soon as she said it, I saw what we were going to do. "Dana," I said, "we need to shut the plant and go uphill." We did it like we'd practiced, but we had never practiced this. We closed the Clearwell outlet valves, shut down the high service pumps, locked out the MCC so nobody could bump a pump by accident, and changed the SCADA set points so if power glitched, the plant wouldn't try to auto-start. We set the chlorine feed to maintain residual inside the Clearwell to keep that water safe for when we could use it later. Then we called the regional control center and told them Riverview was going offline. The operator on the other end swore softly, then told me 3 other towns were reporting civil disturbances and to stay safe. I locked the chlorine room and double-checked the injector suction lines. Dana left a note in a plastic sleeve taped to the door. "Plant secured 11:53, Carter, Dana." The group that went uphill from the plant to the high school was an accident of who showed up at the fence at the right time. Me and Dana, Sergio and his crew, Maya and Tom, Omar from Freshmart, who had a cracked lip and a look like he had left his entire store's life behind when he locked the freezer door and ran. A teacher I recognized only by face, white hair, posture like she fought the workday with humor, who told me later her name was Evelyn Shaw, a retired army mechanic named Jim McKenna, who'd been down by the river fishing when the first infected stumbled along the bank. He had an old toolbox and a way of scanning that never stops. By the time we fought our way through 3 blocks of side streets using the brush truck as escort, our little group had grown by stragglers. A postal worker whose truck had run out of gas, a kid in a marching band hoodie, a pair of librarians who had locked down the branch and walked fast instead of waiting. The high school sat on the ridge east of downtown, a 1970s complex of brick blocks connected by breezeways. The gym faced a wide parking lot where you could get line of sight across the hill to the water tank and beyond to the water plant's elevated tank peeking above the trees. When we got there, Captain Park had already stood 2 engines side by side across the main lot and was directing people in short, clean commands, the way you talk when you need 30 people to do 3 jobs without explaining the theory behind them. "Doors," she said when she saw us. "We need them open now, and we need them welded shut 10 minutes later." Jim's head turned the way a dog's ears do at the word it wants. "Shop?" "Down that hall on the right," Miss Shaw said, because of course the teacher would know. "Mr. Keen's metal shop." We moved like we had a script. Firefighters cleared the hallways, checking classrooms for anyone hiding. PD ran a quick perimeter, then pulled back because the infected heard engine brakes like a dinner bell. Jim and I found the metal shop door and popped it with a key from a custodian who'd already turned a ring of keys into a lifeline. Inside, the shop was an organized world, the kind of place where teens learn that steel responds to rules. MIG welders, oxyacetylene rigs, racks of angle iron and flat bar, a chop saw, a drill press. We rolled 2 welders to the hallway like we were moving refrigerators and ran extension cords to the emergency panel. The power flickered once and held. "Bleachers," Dana said to the coaches who had gathered in the gym with hands on hips in the universal coach stance. "Roll them out, then use the wheels to push them hard up against the doors from the inside." Her voice was calm. She had 3 kids in this school, and in that moment I think she felt the walls like a second skin. Omar took a whiteboard and a marker and turned it into a logistics board, like he was back on a busy Saturday before a storm. "Water, food, sanitation, fuel, comms," he wrote. "Then put names next to each because names turn jobs into something someone will do." I ended up with water, obviously. Miss Shaw put herself on sanitation without flinching. "It's bathrooms that start rumours, not rumours that start bathrooms," she said. And people laughed harder than the joke earned, because laughter resets breathing. Our first hours inside the gym were a clatter of tasks. We welded steel bars across the crash bars of the exterior doors and across the narrow windows at hand height so nobody could pound their way through glass and reach. We blocked the main lobby with bleachers, rolled out, and then pinned by sections of angle iron welded to the floor plates so they couldn't be moved without effort. We dragged the woodshop's scrap plywood to cover the trophy case glass. We posted volunteers with whistles on the inside of each entrance, not to fight, but to call when anything moved. We taped arrows on the floor to create one-way paths, not because infection cares about foot traffic patterns, but because people calm down when they see order. In those hours, pieces of news fell into our laps like bad weather. The hospital had lost power and was on generator. The county had closed bridges over the river after a group of infected had walked across one lane, like sleepwalkers, and caused a pile-up. The state patrol had set barricades at the highway on-ramps and then been pulled to the next town south because something had gone wrong near a truck stop. Someone said they heard the National Guard on the radio, and someone else said that was just rumour. The only thing I knew for sure was that the phones worked and then didn't, and that water is not a plan unless you make it one. We had shut the plant. The clear well held enough to do some good if we could move it. The elevated tank above us still held water, but distribution lines are two-way streets. If someone downstream opens every tap and hydrant, pressure drops and you can't control where the water goes. Worse, if we didn't maintain chlorine residual in the grid, what remained would become a bad soup in a matter of hours. I told Omar and Captain Park and anyone who would listen that we had to treat the water inside the gym like a separate city. Short version, I said at the whiteboard. Boil, filter, distill for infants or anyone with compromised immunity. We don't drink from taps unless it's been boiled and cooled. We set up a fill station and we control it. We keep bathrooms working as long as the sewer holds. We collect rain from the roof if it comes. We rig a small-scale distiller for emergencies. Jim raised a hand. I can build you a distiller from a stock pot and copper coil. Done, Omar said, writing Jim, distiller. Dana took a handful of teenagers and led a class on how to siphon fuel safely. They wheeled the school's maintenance gator around the lot with 5-gallon cans and hit the cars of teachers who had already raised their hands to donate. Fuel meant the generator that ran a corner of the gym would keep a freezer cold, lights on, welders hot, and phones charged until the network gave up entirely. Somewhere past 3 in the afternoon, the sound outside changed. Until then, it had been shouts at a distance and the thump of bodies against doors. Now it was the uneven clatter of footsteps spacing out into the parking lot, the rattle of a loose chain on a flagpole. The hollow slam of a locker door left ajar somewhere in the building. The infected were slower under the sun, and that matters. You could see it in their gait. They moved like people who had worked all night and felt too tired to admit it. But sunset was a clock we couldn't stop. We split our people into shifts. We made food, granola bars, fruit cups, the dry goods from the concession stand. We set up cots and mats along one side of the gym, then moved half of them to the cafeteria because the gym needed space for people to come and go without climbing over each other. We put kids with a teacher and a bag of books in the choir room and called it quiet time, and the name alone smoothed a dozen small storms. We put a notice on the wall that said, "Please keep radios low. We will share updates on the hour." People will drown themselves in bad information if you let them. We handed out whistles to anyone who would go stand at a door for an hour at a time with a buddy. The whistle meant, don't yell, call us without drawing more of them. At dusk, we had our first contact inside. It wasn't dramatic. A custodian's entrance by the loading dock had a lock that was fine on a normal day and inadequate now. 3 infected pushed their way in with a clatter that sounded like all the clatters in the world when you're listening for them. They came in at a fast walk, the kind of stumble that covers ground in a hurry, arms out more for balance than reach. The 2 volunteers at that door blew their whistles and stepped back exactly like we told them. The closest firefighter, Rita, compact and steady, stepped into the doorway with a Halligan tool in her hands. It's a prying bar with a forked end and a pick that firefighters use on doors. She didn't swing it like in a movie. She used it like what it is, a lever. She kept distance, knocked knees out from under the lead infected, used the fork to trap an ankle and drag, then stepped back while 2 more firefighters pulled the bleacher rails we'd cut to length to create a barricade across the hall. Tom and Maya came in from the side and used their presence like a wall. Nobody screamed. The infected hit the rails and held there, pushing, relentless. We slid more rails into place and welded them to brackets we'd bolted into the cinder block. It wasn't choreography, it was work. 10 minutes later, the hall was blocked floor to ceiling with steel like a ship's ladder turned sideways. I went back to the whiteboard and wrote in thicker letters, quiet at night, light discipline. We shut off gym lights except a string above the whiteboard and the kitchen area. The rest of the illumination came from tap lights and headlamps with red lenses. The building changed shape in the dim. The sounds outside grew louder as the infected, who had spent the day under the trees, wandered up toward the noise and warm air at the gym doors. The welds held. The whistles blew, then settled. At midnight, a train went through town, and we all listened to the crossing bells and the blast of the horn because it meant the world was still moving somewhere. I slept 2 hours on a mat with my boots on and dreamed of jar tests, which is the kind of cruel joke your brain plays when it wants to make fun of your job. I got up to relieve the water shift. Jim had built a distiller from a stainless stock pot in the home ec kitchen, a length of copper tubing cannibalized from a spare coil behind the HVAC room, and a cooler of ice that we were treating like currency. The drip into a sanitized jug was slow and beautiful. We labeled everything with painter's tape and a Sharpie. We set up 3 lines, boiled water, filtered then boiled, and distilled. People brought what they had, Brita pitchers, ceramic candle filters, field filters from hiking kits. We paired them with pot lids, tongs, and a rolling boil for 1 minute at our altitude, because details matter when you can't afford to be wrong. We kept a chlorine test kit at the table to check residual in any tap water someone wanted to use for washing. 0.2 mgl free chlorine is the minimum we wanted even for that, and I watched numbers like a gambler watches cards. Around 3 in the morning, someone on the police radio said the words National Guard. Someone else said 72 hours. Later, we would debate whether it had been said at all. Right then, it turned into a plan. We needed to last 3 days. The morning of day 2 started with inventory. Omar took a clipboard and led a group through the cafeteria storeroom. He knew exactly what could stretch and what would create a riot if we rationed it wrong. Miss Shaw and the librarians turned the library into a daycare and a rumour control centre, which are the same thing in a crisis. The firefighters rotated shifts and checked the barricades. PD tried to reach the hospital by radio. All they got was a harried nurse telling them they were short-staffed and needed IV bags and a generator tech. Dana found a pallet of water cases in the gym closet from a state testing day and looked at me with relief that didn't quite make it to her eyes. We can make this last 2 days if we're strict, 3 if we get rain. What about the tank? Someone asked, nodding toward the window where the blue bowl of the elevated water tower peered above the trees. I explained pressure zones and hydraulics to a group that contained an 8th grader and a former city council member. If we open the fire hydrant out back, we can fill containers. but what we take lowers pressure for everyone still at home. If we open too much, air enters the mains and the residual drops. If someone downstream opens a hydrant, it drains faster than we can use it. We need to set a plan. A single hydrant, limited hours, supervised draw, test residual. If we see pressure drop below 20 psi on the school's main, we close. We rigged a sanitary connection for the hydrant with a jumper hose and a backflow preventer we borrowed from the maintenance garage. A belt and suspenders gesture in a world that had lost its belt and half its trousers. We set posted hours. We kept the line orderly. We rotated volunteers because the sound of water running in a long line can make people tense in ways you don't see until they happen. At mid-morning, an argument broke out near the door we had welded most heavily. 3 men wanted to leave to check on family. You can't keep people from walking back into their lives, but you can make them think before they do. Captain Park gave them a map and a radio and wrote on their arms with a Sharpie, name, blood type, if known, and a phone number. She told them the whistle code. 2 short blasts means open the inside barrier in 5 minutes. 1 long blast means do not open under any circumstances. We are compromised. It felt like superstition. It felt like respect. They left with a bundle of bottled water and a promise to return by nightfall, which some people keep and some can't. By noon, we took our first step from defense to offense. It was my fault and my idea in equal measure. The plant's pumps were off, the clear well safe, but the bigger danger was the system still feeding the rest of town, from the elevated tank and the ground storage, because we could not guarantee what was in those pipes anymore. Every hour that passed without positive control made it more likely someone somewhere drank something they shouldn't. We needed to shut the distribution valves that isolate the school's zone from the rest of town, keep this hill as a safe island, and then we needed to shut the big butterfly valves that feed the town from the plant side. It would mean no pressure in most of the town, a decision that would hurt people still in houses. But leaving the grid open was worse now that the infected had learned to twist outdoor spigots and drink like they were trying to remember something their bodies once knew. I laid it out to the group on the whiteboard, drawing circles for tanks and lines for mains, marking 16-inch transmission mains and 8-inch distribution lines, showing where the zone valves sat in pits under lids stamped with water. Jim nodded like a man who had closed circuits in a dozen countries. "We'll need a team," he said. "One to drive, one to turn, one to watch, one to keep time." "I'll go," I said, because they were my valves even if the town belonged to everyone. We took the brush truck again, its bumper bars and radios making a rolling base camp. Tom rode shotgun with a patrol rifle slung low. Jim took the big valve keys, a 5-foot T-handle that engages a square nut on the valve gear, and a can of penetrating oil because nothing in America turns the first time. Dana sat behind me with a map printed from our GIS in the school office, laminated, and held with a magnet on a cookie sheet we appropriated from the kitchen so she could plot in grease pencil. Omar handed us a bag with protein bars, 2 radios, a roll of bright marking tape, and a Sharpie. Miss Shaw put a first aid kit on top and said, "I don't expect to see you use this. Bring it back full, please." We moved fast. Hydrants are landmarks when you know how water moves. We used them like street signs, counting houses to the valve lid in the grass strip. We lifted lids with hooks and found spiders and rust and the square nuts that control small cities. The first valve turned like a well-oiled day. The next took 20 turns and then refused until Jim put his whole weight into the T-handle and I braced it with a foot. The third was under a parked car where someone had fled and left it. Door open and a coffee still steaming inside. We left a note on the dash with a Sharpie. "Borrowed your road. Will return." At Maple and 3rd, we encountered our first cluster of infected up close. 6 of them, a loose group, drawn by the sound of the truck. They moved faster than the ones we'd seen in the heat, their gait a jittery forward shove. Tom stepped out and used his voice first. "Stop, stay back." Because that's how you talk to a person, even when you don't expect an answer. When they kept coming, he backed us to the truck. We didn't try to fight in the open. We'd agreed on that. We retreated 50 feet, turned, and went around the block, because sometimes tactics is just the courage to not do the dumb thing your adrenaline wants. We found the valve from the other side. We shut 6 valves in an hour and felt like we had changed something. Dana marked them on the map in red. The water tower's level dropped a touch and stabilized. The school's pressure stayed solid. People at the hydrant line filled their containers and said thank you in 100 quiet ways that acknowledged that gratitude is also in order. At the 7th valve, we found a man and a woman sitting on their porch. They were older, dressed like they'd been about to attend a church service that never started. They watched us with interest, but not fear. "Is it the water?" the woman asked. I told her what we knew and didn't. She nodded like she'd heard worse. "We've been boiling since yesterday. He did it on the camp stove," she said, tilting her head at the man, who held himself like a soldier in a polite home. "We'll come up to the school later," she added. "Just need to find our old photo album first." I wanted to argue, to insist, to explain probability as if it were kindness. Instead, I said, "The west doors, 2 whistles," and we moved on, because there are battles you win by not turning them into battles at all. The 8th valve was in a pit half filled with muddy water. There's a tool for that, a little gasoline pump the city keeps for dewatering pits. We didn't have it. We had a bucket on a rope and stubbornness. Tom stood watch. Jim bailed. I reached in up to my shoulder and found the square nut, caked in grit. We turned it until my hand cramped and then turned it more. When I pulled my arm out, my skin was striped with rust that looked like something a doctor should worry about, but wasn't the thing you worry about when you can hear feet on pavement half a block away. By late afternoon, we had closed enough of the grid that the school was on its own hydraulic island. It felt like treason and triage and human math. Back at the gym, we updated the board. Omar put a check mark next to water, isolation. He added a line, plant raid, and under it, goal, shut pumps, secure, test. We had shut the pumps. Raid sounded dramatic. What we needed at the plant was quieter. We needed to confirm the clear well integrity, draw a set of samples, and if we could, dose with enough chlorine to keep that water safe for days, then leave it locked and set up so that if power flickered, we didn't accidentally send a slug of anything downstream. We also needed to check the raw water intake for signs of backflow. If the river had pushed into the lower screenhouse, anything could have followed it. If someone upstream had dumped a drum into the river, we'd see chemical fingerprints in an hour if we could get the samples to a lab, which we couldn't. So the point was academic, and the practice was religion. We went at dawn on day 3, before the heat made everything sluggish, and before the infected gathered in larger clots at the sound of any engine. The team was smaller, me, Dana, Tom, and Rita. We took the PD SUV instead of the brush truck to look less like a target. The roads felt like morning after a snowstorm, empty, quiet, not made for you anymore. We reached the plant and found the fence bent where we'd left it, the gate holding, the gravel with footprints like someone had been rehearsing the same steps for hours. We stepped softly. Inside, the plant smelled exactly like a plant should smell. Faint chlorine, wet concrete, metal that has seen water and heat. It calmed me in a way I will never be able to explain to someone who hasn't heard a pump start and thought, my heart too. We checked the chlorine room, totes intact, feed lines tight. We checked the UV rack, powered but idle. We checked the filter gallery, backwash valves closed, filter heads at rest. We sampled the clear well, free chlorine, 1.1, pH 7.2, temperature 12 degrees Celsius, because the clear well sits partial underground and holds cool. We checked the high service pump room, breakers open, locks still on. We turned the SCADA monitors on and off and watched a little line of electrons do exactly what it was told. A level of obedience humans couldn't count on anymore. We were about to leave when we heard a sound from the intake road. It wasn't feet, it was wheels, small wheels. I looked at Tom and he went to the window with the lightest steps I've ever seen a man his size take. He peeked, then motioned us off to the side. A group of infected were moving down the road past the plant, pulling a two-wheeled garden cart, the kind you haul yard clippings in, laden with bottles. Some had their hands on the cart. One had a bottle in both fists, tilted up like he was trying to drink with his jaw too tight. They were headed toward the riverbank, drawn by the sound and sight of water like any animal would be. Something about it cut to the center of me. If this thing was in the water, water had become a weapon and a want. We waited. They moved by. We slipped out later into the day, back to the SUV, and started up the hill. On the corner by the feed store, we met a team we hadn't expected, men in municipal orange vests who were not from our town. They had a flatbed truck and a crane arm, and they were lifting a heavy object off the bed. A skid with a big, square plastic tank, an IBC tote, plumbed with a gas cylinder and a mass of hoses. The labels were the kind you see on a chemical delivery, hazard diamonds, a brand we didn't use. Tom rolled down his window and put a hand up in his universal cop signal for pause. One of the men looked at us like we were background noise. Another kept working the crane controls. The third held a clipboard. I saw the logo on the truck door, an out-of-county contractor the state sometimes uses for flood response. "What's your deployment order?" Tom asked, polite and firm. The man with the clipboard said, "State emergency water augmentation," and pointed at the tote. "We're going to inject this at the distribution main." "What is this?" I asked. "Hypo," he said. "Chlorine. Boost dose. We use sodium hypochlorite every day. It's bleach, industrial strength, shipped with paperwork. Something was wrong here. If they were state deployed, where was the escort? Where was the call to the plant? "Show me the safety data sheet," I said, "because doctrine says, don't let anything into your system you didn't order yourself." The man rolled his eyes. The driver looked nervous. Tom shifted slightly, and the sunlight hit his badge just right. The driver handed me a folder. The sheet inside was for sodium hypochlorite. Concentration 12.5% typical. That's normal. The lot number was blank. The shipper line had been filled in by hand. Dana leaned in. "We're isolated," she said. "Those valves are closed. Where were you going to inject?" The man pointed down the street at a valve pit we had closed yesterday. "There," he said. He didn't know we had closed it because he wasn't talking to anyone we trusted. "New plan," Tom said. "You're going to park this on the school lot and we will check your paperwork. If the state wants to boost, they can come tell us themselves." The man with the clipboard opened his mouth and then closed it because the driver had already cranked the steering wheel toward the school with the weary pragmatism of someone who knows which way the wind is blowing. Back at the gym, we locked the tote in a fence corner and posted it on the whiteboard. Unknown source. Hold. That was the moment I realized what sabotage would look like in a world like ours. It wouldn't be men in masks at midnight. It would be paperwork with one line not filled in. It would be a tanker on a road in the wrong hands. It would be a tote on a flatbed with a handwriting sample the wrong shade of careless. The second afternoon, the infected was slower again in the sun. We used it. The fire crew moved cars to block approaches. We strung lines of tin cans on nylon cord around the back entrances, because a bell ringing at ankle height is sometimes your first warning. We mapped our radio dead zones and put runners where we had to. The school shop became a machine room. Jim cut and welded and taught a kid named Tony how to strike a clean bead. And by nightfall, this high school had half a dozen new apprentices who would never again treat a piece of steel like something that belongs to someone else. At dusk, we held our first full meeting in the gym. We spoke plainly. "The water is not safe without treatment," I said. "We don't know exactly why. We know how to act like it isn't. Boil, filter, distill, store with clean lids. Use chlorine for surfaces. 1 tablespoon of regular bleach in a gallon of water for cleaning, but never mix with anything else. If someone you love is outside, we will not stop you from finding them. If you go in pairs or fours. Carry a whistle. If you meet the infected, do not engage. Back away. Move quiet. Return before dark." Captain Park added the rules of the doors and the whistles and the light. Omar spoke about food, like a captain speaks about a ship's stores. Miss Shaw talked about bathrooms with the same authority she used in a classroom, and when she assigned people to clean Team Alpha and clean Team Bravo, hands went up with the kind of bravery you don't notice until you realize someone just did the job that keeps all the other jobs possible. I spoke last about the next step, the plant raid, which was less about raiding than about shutting the system off from the rest of the region definitively and confirming the clear well and the intake was secure, then bringing back small amounts of water that we ourselves had dosed from the clear well for critical needs we couldn't meet with boiled water alone. A medical room in the nurse's office, infants, elders, too frail to drink enough otherwise. We will not open a spigot to the world, I said. We will take what we can control. We will test like we are under a microscope. The volunteers for that mission were who I knew they would be. Dana, because she doesn't let me do anything dumb by myself. Tom, because he won't let people walk into danger without someone who owns a radio that works. Rita, because she moves like a hinge and doesn't need to be told where to put her hands. And Jim, because anything with a motor or a valve is happier when he's near. Maya wanted to go, but stayed, because someone had to coordinate, and she understood that staying is also a kind of going. Before dawn on day 4, we left again. The light was the slate color of a river before sun. We moved quietly, flashes off, tires finding gravel like we'd installed a sensitivity chip overnight. At the plant, we saw something we hadn't. Footprints that weren't barefoot. A pair of boot tracks led to the side gate and then away. The lock was scratched but intact. Someone had tried and failed or tried, been interrupted, and left. Inside, we found the same stillness we'd left. A post-it note on the lab bench, my handwriting, said chlorine 1.1 yesterday. I wrote 1.0 beneath it and initialed it like we always do. Because if you stop using the habits that make the water safe, the water stops being safe. We drew samples with sterile technique out of mixture sample taps. We set test kits in motion. They can't tell you everything, but they tell you if the world has changed in the specific way they're designed to see. I opened a chlorine tote and measured out a dose as if I were prepping a recipe in a kitchen. We needed to maintain residual for a volume of clear well water that we were now treating as a reservoir, not as throughput. I did the math on a clipboard and then did it again with a different set of numbers, because if those results didn't agree, we'd stand there forever. We had just loaded 2 blue 55-gallon drums, food grade, cleaned and sanitized, onto the SUV's small trailer, gaskets tight, lids secure, when the first group of infected appeared at the fence line. They moved with the sun at their backs like shadows trying to remember depth. Then a second group came from the riverbank, slower, as if the climb had sapped whatever part of their bodies still rationed energy. We had time. We left by the intake road and turned uphill, and the SUV moved like a thought, quiet and focused. On the way back, near the curve by the old grain elevator that never loads anymore, we encountered the thing I had not planned for. 3 men in hunting camo and ball caps had set up a pickup as a roadblock and were flagging cars. They had canteens, bandanas, and a length of chain. They looked like the kind of men who start a generator in a storm and invite a neighbor to plug a fridge into it. They also looked like the kind of men who might decide that water belongs to whoever holds the road. "Morning," Tom said, rolling down the window. "Where you headed?" the tallest said, polite but already drawing lines with his chin. "School," Tom said. "Shelter." "What you carrying?" "Water," Tom said, and I could hear the way he chose the noun over the math. "We got people out by the west lots who need some. Town's not sharing." "Town is everyone," Tom said, "which is something they drill into you at the academy and you don't forget." The tallest man looked at the drums and did some public arithmetic. Then he looked at the rifle on Tom's lap. The math changed. He nodded once and stepped back. "You folks be safe," he said, and I watched him recalibrate who he thought we were. Back at the gym, we rolled the drums to the shaded corner we designated for, treated, to be redosed and tested. No one reached for a cup. Nobody had to be told. We posted the numbers on the board, like the score at a game we could win if we kept playing exactly this hard, exactly this long. That afternoon, we lost our first person. It wasn't to the infected. It was to a heart that had asked too much of itself for too many decades and decided that this day was not one more. His name was Frank, and he had been on Clean Team Bravo. He sat down after lunch and didn't stand up again. The nurse did what nurses do when there's nothing to do. We gathered, quiet and respectful. Miss Shaw took a moment and said a sentence about neighbours that made the gym feel like a room you could breathe in again. We wrote, "Frank, bathroom Bravo, 3:17 p.m. on a sticky note and put it on the whiteboard on a corner by itself, because names deserve a place that isn't a list. Night came. It brought more of them. We rotated watch every hour because the slow motion press of bodies against metal is the kind of thing that wears grooves in your head. The whistles worked until they didn't. We learned to tap on the steel twice with a wrench when we traded positions so the person leaving knew they could unclench their hands. We ate peanut butter sandwiches and canned peaches and the last of the concession stand nacho chips. I made a joke about stadium food in a stadium without a game, and a kid laughed like he hadn't laughed in a day. On the morning of day 5, a new kind of radio traffic filled the air, county-wide coordination on a channel we hadn't used before. A calm voice said, "If you can hear this, this is a combined operations net. We are establishing a perimeter around the hospital and the county building. If you are in a secure location, stay. If you are not, go to a secure location closest to you and shelter." Then a pause. "We have reports of waterborne transmission. Do not drink untreated water. Boil for 1 minute, 3 minutes at elevation. Use safe containers. Do not trust unknown sources." I looked at our whiteboard where we'd written those same words in our own hands. Somehow hearing them in a stranger's voice made me feel less alone and more scared in the same second. We sent another team to the plant that afternoon to retrieve a small metering pump. A portable one we could use to dose a known amount of chlorine into the drums we brought back from the clear well, so we could set an exact residual and then watch the decay over the next 12 hours. That let the nurse set up a tiny medical prep table for washing hands, where water had to be more than just clear and hot. It also meant we were now running a micro-utility in a high school gym, while the town outside mulched itself into a quieter shape. In the late afternoon, the men with the flatbed and the tote came back, this time with a different truck and a patched-in call sign that didn't check out when Maya ran it through her phone. They wanted the tote back. They said a supervisor had signed off. Omar stood there with a spreadsheet he'd drawn on graph paper and told them that inventory control was a real thing here, and that if they wanted to take something off our lot, they could sign it out with a full chain of custody and we'd keep a copy. They didn't want to sign. Tom stood behind Omar and didn't say anything. They left without their tote. That night, we moved the tote inside the welding shop and welded shop's roll-up door shut. At dawn, rain came. Not a storm, just a steady sheet that turned the parking lot into a chalkboard of ripples. We turned the gutters into downspouts into barrels in 20 minutes and Miss Shaw wrote "rain gift" on the board. People lined up with pots and plastic bins and a joy that felt like cheating. We boiled and filtered and boiled again and watched the barrels fill in a way that made 100 small shoulders drop 2 inches. The infected in the rain moved like clocks wound down. We watched them from behind wire mesh we'd welded to the windows and tried not to pretend we recognized faces we probably did. The rain cleaned the air in the gym. It made the weld shop smell like 2 lifetimes of college summers. It made the hallway wax shine under the tap lights, which is a sentence I never thought would make me almost cry. That afternoon, we decided on the second offensive act. A controlled sweep to retrieve essential gear from the firehouse and PD substation. Medical kits, radios, batteries, a portable generator better than the one we were running the kitchen lights off. The team was bigger this time and more formal. 2 PD, 4 fire, me, Dana, and 2 volunteers who knew exactly where everything was in both buildings. We moved in a pair of vehicles, brush truck and SUV, and set departure and return times in thick black letters on the board. We left whistles and radios and a promise to be smarter than we felt. We made it to the firehouse without contact. The bay doors were down. The side door took a key. Inside, everything was where fire departments leave it. Straps neatly hung, gear in place, tools on chargers, radios in slots. We loaded medical kits and an AED and 2 half tanks of O2 and a box of nitrile gloves that felt like treasure. We took a generator, fuel cans, an extra halogen, a bolt cutter, and webbing we could turn into slings or door ties. We left a note, borrowed for school shelter, return when safer, Station 1 family. We meant it. The PD substation was harder. The front glass was cracked. We went around back. The door there had been forced, and then pushed closed again, but not locked. Inside, the lobby was messy in the way of a place that had been opened during a surge and then closed quickly. We stepped carefully. We took radios, spare batteries, the clipboard with forms nobody ever expects to be using when the world tilts, and a set of keys we would need for traffic control boxes if we ever had to turn a signal red and leave it. In Tom's office, he found a photo of his academy class and slid it into his jacket pocket without making a sound. We were leaving when we heard feet in the alley. We froze, not like prey, but like people who have drilled on a hose line and know when not to speak. The footsteps went past. We waited full minutes that felt like slow rain. We left by the front because sometimes the obvious path is the one that buys you another day. Back at the school, people clapped like we'd brought back something better than we did. Maybe we had. Maybe we'd brought back proof that you can walk out and then walk back. On day 7, a vehicle with a state seal actually did pull into the lot. It had a light bar and an antenna that looked like it could hear your heartbeat. A woman in a navy jacket stepped out, hair pinned into obedience, clipboard on a lanyard, and my whole body bristled, not because of her, but because of the clipboard. "I'm with the State Emergency Operations Center," she said. "We're establishing water safety protocols and distribution points. We need to coordinate." We took her inside. We showed her our board. We showed her our barrels and our distiller and our drums from the Clearwell dosed and redosed, according to charts on a legal pad that would have looked familiar to anyone who had ever studied 40 CFR Part 141. She flipped pages, impressed and wary, and then looked up at me. "Do you have any idea what started this?" she asked. I thought about the tote, the upstream fire, the garden cart at the river, the people at the 10K, the feeling at 4 a.m. that something smelled like rain when it shouldn't have. "I have ideas," I said. "No proof." "We're hearing sabotage," she said, not in a dramatic way, but like a line on a form she had to fill. "Bad actors targeting water systems with contaminants that don't show up on standard screens. We don't run LCMS in a high school gym," I said. "We run chlorine and heat and the arithmetic that keeps babies safe." She nodded. "That arithmetic is policy now," she said, and then she set down her clipboard and added a line to our whiteboard. "State to school, hold, guard, eater, unknown." It was the most honest thing anyone with a badge had written since the first day. That night, in the small hours when the whistles had taken on the rhythm of the building, I walked the hall past the metal shop and the home ec kitchen, and the trophy case filled with a decade of kids lifting things above their heads. I stopped at the door we had welded most heavily and listened to the rain on the metal. Behind the door, the infected murmured and moved like people who had lost the thread of their dream and were trying to find it again. I thought of valves and jars and SCADA screens, of the way water moves, whether you watch it or not. I thought of a line on a form left blank on purpose. I thought of the high school gym I had always assumed would be used for basketball and never for holding a town together like a set of hands. Chot, we lasted. Not because a convoy rolled in with bright lights and clearer answers, not because someone cut a ribbon on a new pump, not because a hero stood up and made a speech. We lasted because we wrote rules when nobody else would, and followed them even when no one would have blamed us for not. We lasted because Jim can weld and Miss Shaw can make bathrooms a moral victory, and Omar can turn a whiteboard into a lifeline, and firefighters can turn steel into a door, and PD can use a voice like a hand. We lasted because people who didn't know each other on Friday learned each other's names by Sunday. The worst thing about a waterborne epidemic is that it destroys trust in the simplest act, raising a glass to your mouth. The best thing about surviving one is that you learn to trust something else. The person who tells you the truth without trying to make it pretty. On day 9, the state woman came back with 2 National Guard trucks and a trailer full of test kits that could see more than ours could. She stood in front of the whiteboard and said, "We're going to sample the grid and the plant and the river. We're going to find the line back to where this changed. We're going to turn valves with you. We're going to make a safe zone and then widen it." She pointed at the words we'd written the first day: boil, filter, distill, and said, "This stays until we say otherwise, and then it stays another week for luck." I slept that night more than 2 hours. In my dream, I bled a hydrant and the water ran cold and clear, and I could taste metal that meant nothing but pipes doing what pipes do. I woke to the whistle, got up, checked the metering pump drip by headlamp, logged a number on the legal pad, and put the cap back on the jug. I took a breath. The gym smelled like steel and coffee and people who had agreed to be a city again. It would be a long time before the plant ran water to every tap, before the valves that we had closed opened again, and the lines flushed, and the air spit like anger from faucets that had forgotten how to behave, before we trusted the upstream and the downstream and the paper that moved between them, before we knew if what hit us came from a drum on a truck, or a hand on a valve, or a run of rain in the wrong week, or something we didn't yet know how to see. It would be a long time before the scoreboard came down and was replaced with a sign that said Community Centre in letters big enough a person could see them from the far end of a parking lot filled with barrels catching rain. But we would get there because we had done the hardest part without being asked. We had made a plan and then lived inside it. We would check the clear well and the intake and the filters and the hypochlorite line and the UV rack and the raw water and the other raw water we didn't want to call by its name. We would test and dose and flush and test again until the math told us something that tasted like a promise. And then, one day, we would open a tap, fill a glass, and say to a kid on a mat in a gym, "Drink," and mean it. Until then, we boiled, we filtered, we distilled, we marked our doors with welds and our days with lines on a board. We listened to the whistles and the rain. We told the truth, even when the truth was small and hard. We put our names on the corners of the things we were afraid of, so that when someone asked who did this, there would be an answer, and a person, and a pen line you could follow back to the moment when we decided to keep each other alive. And when I finally stood in the plant again, with the pumps humming, and the SCADA trend line climbing smooth as a heart rate under a steady hand, I put my hand on the rail and said the thing I say every time I leave a shift, and the night is mine to give away: stay in range. Then I locked the door and walked up the hill to the school that had taught us that we already knew how. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.